Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we're going to be breaking down Camilla Fraizer. Now, Cami is a very good friend of mine, and I had the pleasure of coaching her at her very first tournament, and now I have the pleasure of doing this breakdown of her. And Cami is probably one of my favorite fencers that I've ever fought, particularly because she has what I would consider one of the largest bag of tricks that any fencer I've ever fought has ever had. And the reason she has so many tricks is because she has spent so much time adapting to different kinds of fighters in different divisions and with different weapons that she has, I believe, one of the most blade work intensive styles that I have ever seen. So we're going to break this down the way we always do, first with the Zoofectin. But with Cami, there's not a lot of Zoofectin to talk about, and that is because Cami primarily utilizes heavy aggression and passing steps to enter range and dictate her opponent and keep her on the defensive. So the basic idea here is that when you're just trudging forward, there's a couple things that happen. The first is that when they see you, or in this case Cami, coming forward with these big passing steps, what you know is that one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to get an attack straight to the face, or they're just going to walk into range. The problem is that as this comes with a big lunge as well, it basically forces a defensive mindset from the opponent. And that's really all there is to it. There's not a whole lot of nuance when it comes to which leg is forward, which stance is taken, because everything is set up by this walk and these passing steps into range, and everything plays off of just that general aggression. And there's a very good reason for that. And that is, if you just walk into range and you walk into measure, you actually have your own method of dictating distance and timing by simply throwing both of them out the window. Because if you are just going to walk right into distance at the exact same timing every single time, well, your opponent's going to know what you're going to do, but they also have to be able to do something about it. And as you'll see further on, everything stems from this footwork. This first initial walk up where all you do is walk forward and just engage the fight as quickly as possible, you put a lot of people off guard, you put a lot of people on the defensive, and most importantly, you take away about 50% of the options that most people might have had for their own offense. Because even if they're the kind of person who just walks into measure, well, you're just both playing the same game. But if you're not the kind of person who just walks into measure, suddenly you're playing an entirely different game that you are very uncomfortable with. For this opening move, what we see Cami throw probably most of all is his flat, aggressive shield how. And what this shield how accomplishes is that it pairs up with the extremely aggressive footwork and presents a situation where basically throwing two deep passing steps, first with the left foot and then with the right foot, puts Cami in a position where she can extend her arms fully and get a straight line straight from the shoulders here all the way to the target. And what that does is it cuts out any lack of distance in any middleman, and it raises up the point of the bind here so that the opponent has to raise their hands up in order to prevent what they think is probably going to be an Oberhau or just some sort of 45-degree angle cut. But the reason this isn't a 45-degree angle cut, if you would imagine that the arms were not straight here, and the arms came down to here, and then the sword came up, you could see that there would be a huge reduction in distance. So obviously the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and by throwing this shield how flat and directly towards its intended target, you not only get more distance out of your technique, but you ensure that when the blades meet, they are meeting at a position that is higher and more advantageous to the target that you've selected, because your opponent now has to shove their own hands from somewhere maybe down here all the way up to here just to get their strong into a position where it's capable of defending them. Oftentimes too slowly and too late for it to work, as happens in this case. So if we watch this one more time, you see the basic walk down sets up the opponent to be defensive right off the bat, where basically from here, you only have two choices. You can either attack into the attack that you know is coming, or you can take your hands and raise them up to the defensive position and try to parry whatever you know is coming. And in this case, the shield how is very well suited to dealing with both of those situations, because whether or not this is a parry or an Oberhau, you can see that the cross guard is directly forward here, and it's parallel to the ground, which means that in order to throw a cut, a downward cut would get parried by the cross guard and would have to go all this distance here in order to make it to a deep target like the head or the chest. So the arms are protected by the cross guard, and the arms are also just in the way of generally good targets, which means that even if this was an Oberhau, there wouldn't be a lot of things to hit. You could try to go low and go for the leg, but the problem is that the distance here is just almost as long as this distance is here, which means that chances are, even if you do manage to hit the leg, you'll have to sacrifice your entire defense to try to hit it, and you're still, of course, going to get stabbed in the chest. Something that, typically in tournaments and obviously in sort of real life, something you wouldn't consider an even trade. So the second piece to this style is what you throw off of this aggressive forward momentum. And as you can see here, Cammy does these same passing steps that enter range, but right here, there is a feint that comes right with the right step, which up until now has always been used in conjunction with a very aggressive forward attack, that Schielhau or that Oberhau. So now, in preparation for what this person has been told is going to be an attack, they throw a very heavy hand strike towards their opponent in an attempt to just try to chop the hands off on the way in. But because after this feint comes out, Cammy keeps her hands high up in the air, it just barely misses the front of this left hand. And as a result, this follow-up strike can come right back into the gap that was created. So by coming forward so aggressively, it sets up this feint to trigger an overreaction from her opponent. And because there's an overreaction, once this attack and this overreaction misses, there's an even larger opening than normal that can be seized by Cammy in the afterblow as that right foot lands. And it's important to point out that this entire exchange happens while the left foot is on the ground and the right foot is in the air. Here's the feint as the foot is only halfway across. Here's the miss as the foot is maybe 3/4 of the way to its destination. And then right here, as the foot lands, the strike lands, ensuring that this passing step over this entire course is giving you all of the distance that you need to do all of these things. That is why aggressive passing steps walking, into measure sometimes seems a little suicidal, but actually can open up a lot of options as far as distance management goes, because you can choose to put your foot down anywhere during this, little progression. So theoretically, if, the undesired response came from the opponent, this right foot could plant right here after the feint and just stand there, perhaps assuming that the opponent came forward aggressively. This passing step has so many adaptations that can build off of it, as well as when paired with the aggressive walk into measure, that there's really no way of knowing what's going to happen other than if you make a mistake, you are going to get hit. And that sort of mindset that Cammy puts into her opponents puts them in a situation where oftentimes they make mistakes that they wouldn't normally do. And it really puts defensive-oriented fighters on the back foot and in a bad position where suddenly they're having to guess 2-3 steps down the line that all start with the exact same beginning step. And they find that they just can't keep up a reasonable defense without sacrificing some structure or sacrificing some composure. The next little trick that we're going to see here is perhaps a simple one, but one that is equally tied to all of the other options that go off of this kind of ballistic, passing step. As you can see here, there's the exact same passing step into measure, but rather than taking a step with the right foot, Cammy opts to take the long passing step with the left foot. And this doesn't really matter so much. But what matters is that this person here has been so conditioned to the attack coming over and over and over again that they throw this little hand snipe right off the bat. And then as you can see here, they're already taking their left foot off of the ground and pushing as hard as they can backwards with their right leg in an attempt to land that hand shot here and then flee the engagement as quickly as possible. But because of the way that Cammy throws her initial actions, there's nowhere to run, and it's entirely, simple for her to close the distance here with this initial attack, land this thrust straight to the face and get a huge amount of bend in the sword, all before this person is able to change their momentum from at the start of exchange here when they take this step forward to try to move backwards and they can't get out fast enough. The forward momentum that they carry with them from the beginning here as their foot lands prevents them from going backwards fast enough to get out of the way. So while it's always an option that when you're charging straight forward, someone can just always hit you the second you enter measure, there is an existential threat attached to this. That because you know that Cami is always going to throw this big, long, well-extended and committed attack, if you try to pick at her hands or at her legs as she's coming forward, well, you have to sacrifice your defense in order to do so. And it's pretty much Cami's obligation here that she's going to ensure that you regret that decision. Because if you can pick Cami apart as she walks forward while running backwards yourself, that's generally how people will counteract aggressive fencers. So in order to counteract the counteract, what you have to make sure of is that everyone basically has it in their brain, whether it's true or not, that anytime you try to attack Cami's hands or legs or something that's just a lower priority target, you're going to get hit in the highest possible priority target, and you're going to regret what you've done. And this sort of aggression, again, like all of the other techniques, puts people on the back foot in such a place that they're very deeply uncomfortable, and they can't use some of the techniques and the plays and the defensive mindsets that they usually feel comfortable with. And that makes people fence, honestly, demonstrably worse than normally they would. So there's one last trick that can be thrown off of this passing aggressive step, and that is, of course, the pull back and cut to a different opening. It's a bread and butter technique that a whole lot of people use, but what Cami does differently is that the aggression that this footwork and all of these other techniques does is it contributes an air of, like intimidation that makes opponents parry far harder than they really mean to. And like, look at how much this weapon goes up. The reason the arms are all the way up here is because this person has been hit by Schielhaus, by Oberhaus, and aggressive, very high line and far distance techniques that has basically conditioned this person to throw up their guard as high as they possibly can, because every single other time that they've been hit in this area, and that's the last thing that they want to happen. And of course, knowing this, Cami immediately pivots and throws the cut to the outside low onto the shoulder in a place that is completely undefended, knowing that all of the conditioning that she's done up until now to convince her opponents that this next attack is coming high, just like every single other from before, is now the exact time that she throws up a feint and attacks another line. And because of all the footwork and all the setup that's gone into this, it's so much more effective than normal. Again, this is a technique that people throw all the time. You see it pretty much. I don't think there's a single fencer who's gone to a tournament who hasn't either seen this technique or hasn't been hit by this technique. But the difference here is that the footwork is essential to setting it up and essential to making it as critically effective as it is. So up until this point, the kind of things we've been seeing are from, maximum distance and right outside the Zoofected. But this particular set of techniques really showcases Cami's mid-range, or I guess more normal range, fencing game. So right here, after this technique misses, this is the distance that I feel most people are most comfortable fighting at. It's typically the distance that most people set themselves up in, just in a kind of mutual agreement, when two people will march into the middle of the ring and stand right at this kind of distance from each other, and then almost in their own brains go, okay, now we're going to have our fight. So from this position, Cami does a few very, very intelligent things, and that is to utilize a principle known as like true times, where you get into a distance where you can hit pretty much anywhere with anything, and then you throw very, very confusing looping feints and other techniques to ensure that the opponent has no idea what's coming. And if you can get them to try to block it, it's very, very unlikely that they'll be able to choose the correct block. So if we watch this little sequence here, right after this technique is done and this little exchange is over, Cami pulls her hands back and puts her sword over her shoulder. And while this isn't a very defensive position, what it is, it's a very confusing position because there are really three techniques that she can throw from here. She can throw right from where it is an Oberhau, straight to the top, higher opening. She can throw a middle Hau, a little bit lower, straight to the hands, or she can throw an Unterhau up and either to the arms or to the legs if they are a little bit closer. So right now we have someone who's right leg forward and left leg forward, or sorry, both right leg forward, which means that typically this left leg isn't actually any closer to the target. So the left leg option isn't really in the mix right now. But of course, what does happen is Cami throws a very deceptive looking Schielhau or Zwerchhau, and it basically comes in the exact line of a middle Hau, striking the hands in a position where this opponent clearly didn't, expect it. So as these hands pull back and the feint is basically set up, there are three options, and this person basically just opts to try to lower their hands and parry what they thought was, and it's kind of hard to tell with the footage, but they windshield wipered their sword from their right side to their left side, assuming that this was going to be a high line cut up until their upper shoulder. Instead, what happened was this Zwerchhau, which normally is very difficult to range properly, comes right in under the crossguard into the flat of the hands. And look at the structure that we have here when this lands. Basically, for a lot of people, when they throw Zwerchhaus, they have a very hard time getting them in line with the shoulder, but this one is almost perfect. There is, again, a straight line straight from the top of the shoulder to the wrist, to the sword, to the target. And again, that means that there was no loss of distance here, despite the fact that this began with Cami basically pulling her hands all the way back to her shoulder. There was no loss of distance when the technique actually landed, which means that all of those other options could have also have been thrown with the same amount of distance. That leg shot could have come, that head shot could have come, anything could have come. And not knowing what's coming is the number one reason why people's defenses fail. So here we have another example of this mid-range fencing again, and another expert use of feints and broken timing. So right here, Cami has once again pulled her hands back and her sword basically over her shoulder. And what this means is that as this attack comes down, this person has absolutely no idea what strike is coming. They throw their hands up into an ox because the assumption is that this is going to be an Oberhau. But well after Cami's right foot lands in the lunge, which if you go all the way back to here, you can see that there was a lifting of the foot, and along with the pulling back of the sword in the hands, the foot lands, but the strike hasn't come yet. And what that means is that Cami gave herself like a quarter of a second's time to figure out what guard her opponent was throwing up, and then to throw the attack completely on the opposite place of that guard. This person even lifted up their leg because they were afraid that some sort of low line shin cut was coming. But nope, the cut that came in hit the one target that, of course, you can't really move very meaningfully and is very hard to cover with a hang and parry, and that is the lower end of the ribs. So what this means is that when Cami does enter this mid-range, and assuming that the initial action hasn't quite landed, she's more than capable of using this distance to set up a network of intricate feints and different target selections to ensure that as soon as she gets you to throw up any sort of defense, she's going to hit you wherever you're not covered. And because of the distance that you've placed yourself at, she knows that she can hit anywhere and that you can hit anywhere. And if she can get you into that defensive mindset, again, all the way at the beginning of the fight with the aggressive forward footwork, she can open up a target and hit pretty much anywhere. So the final piece of this puzzle is a concept that I think many people will call bind denial. Now, Cami does not fence in a very bind-centric style, and part of what that means is that whenever she enters measure and she is not throwing a very aggressive forward cut like a Schielhau or an Oberhau, one thing that you see happen a lot is that she'll pull her hands back into this, again, like starting feint position. And what you'll see a lot of people do is, due to the fact that they've been conditioned this whole time to expect that heavy forward momentum, is watch what this person does with their hands and their sword. They push up and forward, completely neglecting to present any kind of threat because they expect the shield hell right over into their left shoulder. And so they push their hands directly into where they think that threat is going to come from. And what that means is that oftentimes, rather than getting the bind that they want, they instead end up accidentally throwing their hands into a completely indefensible situation and get, hit by the counterattack afterwards. Their attempt to close and finish blocked off by the fact that Cammy has cut the angle directly in between their legs, and trying to pull your hands from the top left corner of your body all the way down to the bottom, or basically the top right to the bottom right corner of your body, just means that you're going to have to go through this middle hell that just hit you in the chest. And you see this tactic work all the time, again, because it meshes so very well with the highly aggressive style. You see, again, right from the start, Cammy marches straight forward into measure and predicts the fact that her opponent is going to throw a heavy defense as the first option and punishes it in kind. But the feint, unlike with many other feints, is not a feigned attack, but simply the threat of the attack from the other exchanges. And the feint is simply a pulling back of the sword into a position where it simply cannot be bound with. And for a lot of people, this would be a huge risk factor because of how much it exposes the hands right here. If this person had simply thrown a hand shot going forward, well, obviously they would have had a clean shot on Cammy's hands. But again, so much of this relies on that threat of that initial action that you can get people to do something that they wouldn't normally do and not recognize targets that are being presented right to them, because that threat of that first attack is so ever present that they're going to overcommit to a defense or to a bind just to try to get past that initial cut and past that initial range into, unfortunately, what is a pretty simple follow-up. So the final question then is, what happens when all this fails and somebody manages to get into a very close bind? And the answer is that, of course, like anything, Cammy is pretty well versed in grappling. Namely, that the second we get into a position where the initial action failed, the follow-up action failed, and the hands have finally smashed together and nothing else can be thrown, Cammy pulls her left hand off of her sword and does what any good HEMA grappler should do, which is to take that left hand and immediately put it over as many hands and as many pieces of the sword as you possibly can and pull down in order to restrain your opponent's ability to throw anything back. Now, in this case, at the exact same time as she's doing this, she's doing what I think most people would call like a very basic one-handed shield hell plunging cut here, where the basic idea is that when you throw your left hand over your opponent, you take your right hand and you shoot it up into the sky as far as you can. Going all the way back here, right after that Unterhaum misses, you see this right hand disconnect and go straight up into the air. And the reason for that is two things. From here, you can bring it straight down and pommel by just taking the lower half of your sword and putting it straight into their head. Or you can do what Cammy does here, which is take the tip of your sword, turn the edge down, and try to drop it down and around on top of your opponent's head. And the reason you want those two different options is because it requires two different defenses from your opponent. Most people who have kept both hands on their sword will immediately release one of their arms and take their left arm and put it towards your arm in order to try to stop you from throwing this cut. The problem is that will prevent the pommel from coming straight down because there's an arm going straight up in oppositional force, and you can't successfully pommel without, that amount of distance and travel. However, if you're going straight up to try to block the hand, that doesn't actually restrain this attack, because as you see with the follow-up here, the cut kind of comes down and around. Basically, whenever you're trying to restrain somebody for a pommel strike, you leave yourself open here to this roundabout downward plunging cut because you can't keep your hand off the sword and up into your opponent's hand at the same time as you defend what is essentially the right side of your body with a sword that is now pinned. Now, in this particular case, Cammy gets a little unlucky because the sword got pinned in an awkward position where it accidentally parried the follow-up blow. But what's important to see here is that there's not a lot that the other person can do once the situation arises where this left arm is over the sword arm. The sword effectively becomes useless because no matter how much leverage you try to put on it with this left hand over here, you can't really make the sword travel any distance. You can't slice because you can't pull your hand out or in and make the blade travel a meaningful distance along Cammy's body. And more importantly, you can't leverage it up and back down to perform some kind of cut because it's pinned on the inside with a bicep tie by Cammy's left arm. So all you can really do is either hope that this sword gets out of this situation and you can wrench your arms free, or hope, as happens here, that you just sort of get into a position where you can guess the right attack that comes from this and, parry the pommel or the cut and, tie up the sword arm of Cammy or the other person here and just get to a more neutral grappling position. So with that, we see that Cammy has a plan and a tight gameplay loop for all three distance measures, where she has something that she almost very consistently does from the outside, with a big, heavy, aggressive attack. She has something she does from the mid-range with extremely confusing feints and cuts. And she finally has this grapple game that she can do if all of those previous two somehow fails. So with that, you have the profile of a very complete fencer that can really adapt any one of these three distance strategies to whatever opponent she might be fighting. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.